Hi, everybody. Welcome to our UX Academy Alumni Spotlight. I'm here with Peter Noah to hear more about his journey. We've got lots of questions for him, but before I dive in, let me introduce myself and get you all up and running in the system. My name is Jessica Campbell. I'm the Mentor Operations Lead here at Design Lab. And I'm just your guide today. All the interesting stuff comes from Peter. If y'all can pop into the chat and say hi, let us know where you're coming from. We would love that. As we move along, I want to hear from you all. So if you have questions as we go, please pop those into the questions tab, specifically down there at the bottom. And I will make sure to monitor that and respond, highlight those up. So please pop your questions in the questions tab. Once we get rolling, I won't be in the chat tab as much. But Peter graduated from Design Lab back in August now and works for Artsy. So let's get rolling. Peter, tell me a little bit about what you were doing before the UX Academy. Like what made you pursue or interested in pursuing UX?
I was working as the director of marketing and brand creative for Getty Images. And I had been doing that for several years. And actually, my entire career is based in the world of marketing and advertising. I had built up a career on the in-house studio side of the equation. And at a certain point during the pandemic, I was realizing that I wasn't, the trajectory of my career wasn't exactly going the way that I had thought it was going to. And I had gotten to several conversations with folks on the product side in some projects that we were working on together. And that's when I started getting a real sincere interest in product design. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And that's kind of when I decided, you know what, let me take this a little bit more seriously and take the next step to figure out how I can learn as much as I possibly can and whether this career transition would really work out for me.
Yeah. And why did you choose Design Lab over the many other options that are out there in the world?
So yeah, there were definitely a lot of options. When I was looking, there were so many options that I actually had to create a spreadsheet to keep all of the options in one view. And then what I did was I kind of created a requirements matrix, like what are the things that are important to me? And what do these various different UX boot camps offer? And I had to sort of weigh those variables like cost versus features. So some of the things that were really important to me were things like the availability of mentorship, a portfolio that's built on like the work that you do during the curriculum. Tuition guarantee was really important to me. So looking at all of those factors, and the most important thing for me was to be able to do the program part-time while I was actually full-time employed. So all of those variables I took into account, and at the end of the day, I decided on Design Lab. And I will say, I tried to find people who actually went through these programs so that I can interview them and talk to them about what their experience was like and why they would recommend that program over any others.
Yeah. So you were able to connect with folks through LinkedIn or whatever who had gone through our program or other programs who were open to chatting with you about their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really, really important part of my deciding which program to go with. And that's why I went with Design Lab. It ticked off all of the boxes for me at the time, which was part-time, part-time studying, mentorship opportunities, tuition guarantee, portfolio guarantee, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we may have folks in the chat or in this event here who don't have any previous design experience. What do you feel like your main pieces of advice would be regarding the UXA program and transitioning into this field in general?
That's a really good question. I was actually also very concerned about that because my background and experience is specific. It's specific to marketing and advertising. It doesn't necessarily have a direct correlation to UX design. However, I will say, looking back on this experience now and everything that I've learned, it almost kind of doesn't matter, believe it or not. I think it really depends on what your interest is in the world of UX. And that's a pretty big world. That's a very wide spectrum. And why you think you would be a good contributor to that world. And the reason why you are interested in UX is probably because you have a sincere interest in one of like dozens and dozens of things like research, UX writing, UI design. I mean, there can be all kinds of things that you might be interested in. And I think it's just a matter of identifying what your strengths are and what you're bringing to the table and how to align that with the specific course of UX work that you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you, overall transitioning into the program, how did you find the UX program at Design Lab in general? Let's just start there. Overall, what were your impressions of the UX Academy stepping into it?
So I would say the curriculum was pretty thorough in the sense that there was a lot covered. For sure, in the beginning, I felt like there was so much being covered that it was really difficult to get deep into any one specific thing. But I also acknowledged that there wasn't, it's not like an infinite amount of time. Like I really wanted to get through it as quickly as possible. So my impression was that there's a lot. It's difficult to absorb. And yeah,
Yeah.
I think the mentor part of it was super helpful to me because having those perspectives and being able to sort of have conversations with mentors about the assignments. For example, I frequently had conversations with my mentors about like, well, is this practiced in the real world? Like, do you actually do this?
Right.
And sometimes the answer was yes, and sometimes the answer was no. And it was helpful to understand that context. I think the other thing that I really kind of struggled with was, as I mentioned, I felt like it was an overwhelming amount of information at times. I think I struggled with trying to understand like, well, when do I use this, or when would I do this? I kind of looked at the whole thing when I started the program as like very prescriptive in that, oh, I'm going to need to know like 100 different research techniques, and I'm going to have to apply them all in this order.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, confused the hell out of me because I'm like, why would I do that?
Yeah.
But then, in sort of working through the exercises and the assignments and doing the work and speaking with my mentors, it dawned on me eventually. It took me a while that all of these things are tools. They're tools to get to a common goal, which is to solve a problem, to solve a UX problem. Which tools you use is really kind of like, that's where the magic is. Like, which tools do you use? Which do you combine? What do you learn from them to get closer to the resolution of your problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a couple questions in the chat, but I wanted to kind of follow on that because you talked about some of the struggles. What would you say your favorite part, or even just like a high point of your journey in the UX, something that really, made it sing for you?
I think my favorite part of the experience was doing the assignments and working with my mentors to iterate on those assignments. I will admit, at first, it felt a little bit like, why am I having to do this over and over again? But actually, that's what UX is. That's, it's essentially at the heart of it. It's like you're constantly iterating to improve upon like where you began. So the problem is never like fully solved. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it because that allowed me to sort of understand the context of what I was doing in the real world. And that gave me an opportunity to talk to my mentors about like their life experiences and what I could expect. So
Mhm.
I really enjoyed that connecting to reality versus like being in a classroom setting and like not really understanding like, well, what would life really be like as a UX practitioner?
Right, right. You get all, like you mentioned, all of the tools up front, all of the things you could possibly use in the experience, and pair that with somebody who's like,
Right,
and here's how I've never done that thing, or I know
right,
people have done that thing, or I do that part of it absolutely every time. Um,
right.
yeah, absolutely. So let me pop over to some of the questions here. Let's start some of these live. Um, so we've got a couple of people who feel your story is very similar. Did you find any challenges to being an older transitioner and interviewing for UX UI design jobs versus,
Yes,
yeah, talk to us a little bit about that. Yes, and how did you work
100%.
that?
100%. So when I started interviewing, I was very conscious of the fact that I'm an older person.
Mhm.
I was very conscious of the fact that my LinkedIn and my resume, all of it's going to scream, this guy's like really old and he's transitioning from this thing that has nothing to do with UX. So that was kind of like my mindset. And I was really scared of that. And I felt like I needed to hide like every aspect of who I was because I was worried that I needed to do that in order to increase my chances of getting interviews.
Mhm.
That was very, very traumatizing for me on a certain level because I didn't know what to expect going into the job application process. And then when I started getting the rejection emails and the rejection notices, that sort of like compounded the feeling that like I'm never going to be able to make this transition because I'm older.
Mhm.
Um, but something that I did during the whole process was that I made a concerted effort to ask for feedback,
Mhm.
whether whether it was feedback from rejection emails or whether it was feedback from interviews or especially feedback from recruiters that I worked with,
Mhm.
because they would often be the first and the follow-up contact after I had interviews. So what I learned from those feedback sessions or the feedback messages was that actually all of that stuff that I was worried about was stuff that I never had to worry about. And that's what I would say to anybody who's maybe older or more experienced. It wasn't ever about like my age or my experience. Sometimes it was a concern about like, well, we can't afford this person. So there
Right.
was like an assumption made. That's incorrect. Or sometimes it was actually in several instances, it was the case where they understood where I was coming from and they understood what I needed, but they actually didn't have the framework to support me in terms of ensuring my success. Like a really good example of that is I had several interviews at Charles Schwab for a product designer, and I made it very, very far. And I was very candid with them in terms of like, well, this is who I am, this is my background, this is what I have to offer. And they were also very candid with me in terms of like what they had to offer. And they walked away and they said, well, give us a little bit of time to sort of figure out whether we can make this role happen for you. And they came back and they said, I'm sorry, we can't make this role happen for you.
Mhm.
And at first, I was like a little bit disappointed. But then when I asked for feedback, what they told me was, we really wanted you on board because we really feel that you have the aptitude and the kind of sensibility that we're looking for in a product designer for our team. But we are also very cognizant of the fact that we want our product designers to succeed. And we don't necessarily feel that we have the right framework for you to really excel. And that is the primary reason why we can't bring you on board.
Yeah.
Another really good example of that is I had an interview at Google. It was for a contract position for 12, I think it was for 12 months. And I was like, yes, Google, I got a Google interview. Amazing, right?
Yeah.
And I was so hyped for that. And I could not have tried harder to do well on that interview.
Yeah.
But in the end, like it just didn't work out.
Yeah.
And the feedback that I got, the reason why it didn't work out is because they needed somebody that they could drop in to an existing team.
Mhm.
They needed somebody who could like just hit the ground running with little to no like management, to be able to run completely autonomously. So, I mean, that's obviously not the ideal situation for me because I actually don't have like practical day-to-day work
Yeah.
experience as a product designer. So, I mean, that's totally legit and fair. So
Yep.
I think the message that I would send is like, don't sweat whoever you are, whatever your situation is. Be as transparent as possible about that, and be as transparent as possible about what you bring to the table. Because it's, to me, in my experience, it was about finding the fit. It was about
Yeah.
finding the right home for me, for who I am in this part of my journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to be true whether you're a junior or senior in your field, right? But
Yeah,
I do understand the imposter syndrome and the fear that goes with making a transition, right? It can't, it feels, it's different, right?
for sure.
Um, but super valuable. And I'm glad that you were able to, as I'm a former recruiter, bring that experience in because it is valuable experience. Um, so we've got another one coming from graphic and marketing design as well. How would you compare your experience as a graphic designer versus a UX UI designer? Differences, was it, similarities, things like that?
So the world of graphic design in the context of marketing is very different,
Mhm.
obviously, because you're just dealing with different kinds of deliverables and you don't necessarily iterate constantly like in the world of product design. And I will say that my title at Artsy is product designer, not UX UI designer. And
Mhm.
I make that distinction because one thing that I realized very quickly in my job search is that the same title might not mean the same responsibilities at company A versus company B.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you are working as a product designer in company A and that company has 500 employees, and you're a product designer at company B that has 20 employees, trust me, your job is going to be very, very different.
Yeah.
Um, so I will say the thing that translates very, very well from the world of graphic design and marketing is that if you have, you know, if you have skills in that arena in graphic design and marketing, you probably have developed an eye for what looks right and what doesn't look right. And that
Mhm.
will serve you really, really well in the world of UX, UI design, product design, because a lot of those nuances of like, well, this doesn't look totally right, and I'm not sure why, is a good instinct to follow, because that probably means it's not right or it doesn't work for whatever reason. And then, when you scratch the surface and you dig a little deeper, you figure out a solution that is, a little bit more plausible in the scheme of the design system you're working in or whatever. But I think all of those like aesthetic skills that you develop as a graphic designer are important. But designing in the world of UX UI is a little bit different, I think.
Yeah.
And that's something
Yeah.
that I'm learning right now.
Yeah. And so, kind of in that same vein, we did have someone who specifically asked the question, um, and I think we can expand upon this, but why did you choose to pursue UX design rather than UI design? And maybe we can talk about more product design
Yeah.
versus UX, kind of the terminology within this world that's a little wild.
Well, so I have a little bit more of a work history. I'm the kind of person who's like really interested in the big picture. I do sweat the details, and I'm all about details. And I think design is really successful when you fine tune those details. But I am sort of like a big picture person. I did not follow a UI design path because I wanted to be more involved in the bigger sort of visioning of a product. And Artsy was a really great match for me because it is a fully developed product design team. but they enable the product designers to kind of take like real ownership of the projects that they're working on. So it enables me to sort of like see the big picture and work with the product manager to understand the strategy, understand like where design decisions are going to affect that strategy. I get to work with engineers and have conversations with them to understand like how to translate their requirements into design decisions. So, excuse me, I sort of feel like I get to see the big picture, whereas I think a UI designer has to really, really be specific about like the design components that they're working on that feed into the design system. And that's a really big responsibility, but I think that's a different kind of designer, and you have to really be committed to that to really excel at that.
Yeah.
And like I said, I feel like given my work experience and the fact that I used to manage a really, not a big team, but I used to manage a fairly large team. And I was kind of responsible for the bigger picture of the marketing decisions at a fairly large company. I think
Yeah.
I still wanted to have like a little bit of a big picture view of the projects that I was working on. And I think being a product designer at a company like Artsy enables me to not only affect design decisions, but also kind of still work at a very high level and work with strategy and direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to say for Daphne, and for anybody in this call who hasn't been through the UX Academy, you do learn UI and have to create UI assets for your portfolio as a part of the process. The program is very much about learning generalist skills and being able to display those. But absolutely, to Peter's point, you get to decide from there what actually speaks to you from working knowledge, right? From actually trying your hand at something.
Right. I will also add to that point. When I was interviewing, I did wind up having at the very last stage of my interview process, I did wind up having two offers, and one was a UI designer for CVS, and one was as a product designer for Artsy. And that's kind of when I made that decision. I really thought hard about like, what is it that I want to do? What is it that I want to focus on? Yeah, so you will also have that opportunity when you go out and interview. Like, you don't necessarily have to just choose like one kind of title. Like, it may be that your skill set, runs across several different specialties, and to be able to explore that, I think is like a really, really great opportunity to sort of understand where your career can go.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of it can evolve, right? Like this was a moment where you evolved. So I want to go back to some of your experience in Design Lab, and then we'll kind of go back into questions folks have about interviewing. But Elizabeth has a really good question. What would be your top recommendations for optimizing conversations with a mentor?
Optimizing conversations with your mentor. I think what really worked for me was, well, I lucked out in that I found mentors that really spoke to me, like resonated with me. I felt very comfortable asking them very sort of matter-of-fact questions about the work that they do. I think approach them as you might approach like, anything that you don't have any understanding of. Like, you want to ask them as many questions as you can. Like, what are your meetings like? How long does it take to work on a project? Like, what do your projects look like? Like, are they small? Are they large? Give me an example of a creative brief that you've seen. What are some of the problems that you face at work? That was really important to sort of understand, like, well, what are the politics like at companies like of varying sizes, and like how do you deal with that? Or like, what's the career trajectory for you look like? I'm interested in those kinds of things too, and like being able to have those frank conversations with your mentor and like getting honest responses, I think really helped me understand like where I needed to put my efforts.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could, as a mentor ops person, could not agree more. Please ask them all the questions. That's why they're here.
Yeah.
And I think it's good to remember that it is relationship building, right? Like it's,
for sure.
it's a human. you're just meeting and you're like, okay, we're dating now, kind of like we're in it. Like we're not just like testing the waters. This is like we're working together. We're working together. So yeah, asking them
I think
questions.
yeah, that's a really great analogy, actually. I think it's sort of like dating. You're meeting this person, and the idea is that you want to connect, so that
Mhm.
you can create something out of that connection. And that's not going to happen unless you're like totally transparent with them, and you really kind of um, take their presence for like why they're there, and sort of take advantage of that.
Yeah.
The more you do that, and the more like real you can be with them, about your fears and about what you want, I think the more it's going to benefit you when you do graduate and you hit the ground running, looking for a
Yeah.
job.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, that candor can be scary, but
Yeah.
I think designers as a whole, like we'll just call it that as a whole, right? We can delineate job titles. You come into this because you have an empathetic nature, and so most of these people have a lot of empathy for what you're going through, um,
Hmm.
and are able to get in there with you if you share that. So kind of moving back to, we've got a lot of questions about your interview process and the job
Yeah.
journey. So do you have any tips on the interviewing process? And then what was
Yeah.
that transition like from the academy to your first role with Artsy?
So my initial interviews were kind of awkward. And they were because I was sort of I had built up the thinking that like I'm gonna have to be like completely buttoned up and on point, and I'm gonna have to know everything, and oh my God, they're gonna find out that I don't know anything, and like what's gonna happen. Um, but I realized, after I had several interviews, that it's not like that at all. They understand like where you're coming from. They understand that you were, in a different career in your former life, and that you went to this boot camp. That's all obvious. So like, there's no point in trying to mask that or hide that. I think it's about like understanding. Again, I think it's about fit, and understanding like what kind of fit that they're looking for, and whether you might be a good candidate for that fit. So to me, I think it was my interviews got better as I sort of relaxed a bit more and sort of understood what they were looking for, and to see how I can tailor my presentations to accommodate like what might be like important for them. So
Mhm.
most of the initial interviews were really about like just kind of getting to know you and sort of understanding like what it is that you're looking for, and like what it is that they have to offer, and whether you can maybe talk through some of the case studies that you have in your portfolio, in an intelligent way that like convinces them that you have the aptitude to be able to potentially present like work in front of like internal clients or external clients. Um, so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Were you asking about the interview process?
Tips on the interviewing process.
Yeah, right. The other thing that became very apparent to me was in several of the interviews where I went from like, second interview to third interview, um, I needed to come up with additional work to be able to present as case studies. This became really, really important for the fourth round interviews for like Artsy and CVS, where I ultimately got offers. In both instances, they wanted to see two case studies presented to them that dealt with how data affected design decision making, and like what the before and after looked like. So in working with Artsy to sort of figure out how to best do this, they knew that I wasn't a product designer. So we agreed that it would make total sense for me to draw up examples from my experience as a designer in the marketing space. So that's what
Mhm.
I did. I created a case study based out of that experience, and I presented it to them. And then the other thing I would say is I also there was a little bit of a period where I quit my job without a job, because I was like, you know what, this is a full-time job in and of itself, and I'm going to take this risk because I might as well do it. I might as well go whole hog. And I picked up some freelance work in the UX space, and it was very short term. It was really, really really, really quick and dirty.
Yeah.
However, the really, really good benefit for that of that was that the the real hands-on work that I had to complete in like 3 weeks was so different from the classroom work that it allowed me to talk about like how I understand the difference between like work that's done in a controlled environment, like in a classroom, where
Mhm.
you get to explore like almost every aspect of the UX design spectrum, compared to like work in a real scenario where you might only have 3 weeks to come up with a high fidelity prototype, and you don't have any research, or the research is garbage, and you have to rely on like one interview. So, or you know you don't have time to do like a full UI design. So like these are all constraints that are present in the real world.
Right.
And so being able to talk to that, I think really worked in my favor. Being able to say like, yeah, this is a project that I completed, and I'm going to talk to you about it. But
Yeah.
you know that it's not perfect, and know that I did the best that I could given the resources that I had. And that's actually what I have found to be true in my real job. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't change just because you're not freelancing
no,
necessarily.
it absolutely doesn't change. I mean, so I've only been at Artsy for about 3 months. So they've been extremely generous in terms of the onboarding process. So it gave me like a really, really long road to be able to get to know people, get to understand the company, get to understand the business. But yeah, I mean, I was sort of used to this idea that the design process was like the double diamond, and it
Yeah.
was start to finish, and it was like really clean, and like you end up at every point and you really know what you're doing. But that's actually like not totally the case. It's difficult to have meetings with everybody in the company, that you need to talk to inform your design. Sometimes I can't get research on certain aspects that I think are important to my design. And then you have to figure out, well, what's plan B going to be on that?
Yeah.
The design system might not be like fully fleshed out, and like, what am I going to do about that? So there are all kinds of things that come up as issues in the process in my reality of being a product designer that I think, yeah, it's just part of life.
Yeah. So we've got folks that kind of thinking about that interview process and creating case studies and stuff. We have a couple folks who've asked questions about like their portfolio. So this Cassandra is starting phase 2 this week. Congrats.
Mhm.
Um, and they're creating their portfolio. My mentor references you being a great example for a great portfolio, and said you were in the alumni spotlight. I would love to know more about your process in creating your portfolio and if you have any tips for the group.
Sure. So my process for creating my portfolio was that I did not want to spend a whole ton of time on the actual like vehicle for the portfolio. Like I
Mhm.
use Squarespace, and the reason why I use Squarespace is because that's a pretty big company and that's a pretty big product, and they kind of figured it out like how to make it work for a lot of people. So that was important. I did not want to invest a whole bunch of time in trying to learn how to code to be able to get my website up and running. So that out of the way, I next decided like, well, what do my case studies look like? What's the story that I'm going to tell? So being able to outline that and being able to sort of understand the storytelling aspect of my portfolio was like super important. And then really, it was just a matter of like, I mean, it's a lot of work. It's a ton of work putting a portfolio together.
Yeah.
And I had to go through many, many iterations of that. In working with my mentor on the portfolio, I can't tell you how many times like he said to me, yeah, you're showing all this stuff. Like you're showing like, you have these flow charts and you have these, X, Y, and Z things, but like you say that you did them, but like who cares that you did them? It's more
Right.
important to show like why did you do them and what did you learn from them? How did doing this, push your UX process further along the line? Like, how did it create more learnings for you so that you could then sort of get closer to the finish line? So that was really tough for me to sort of understand because, I thought, oh, well, if I just put a couple of personas on my portfolio page, like, one and done, it's like, just like that. Um, but you have to sort of like be able to understand like, well, what do these personas do for this project? Like, how do they help get me to the finish line?
Yeah.
So I think that was like super important. In the end, to me, it was all about like uh, good storytelling, thorough storytelling, making sure that there were takeaways like learnings that were maybe would not have been clear to me otherwise if had I not gone through the process. Also,
Yeah.
I wanted the portfolio to reflect like who I was as a designer, which is kind of like why it's very kind of it's pretty organized and it's pretty clean and there's a lot of negative space. And that's just kind of who I am. I approach my design projects as like, this is the canvas. It's a blank canvas and it's really about you, the client. So the client work sort of takes front and center. It's not so much about me. So I wasn't so concerned about like personal branding, although I think the finished product is a reflection of my personal branding.
Yes. And again, I'll throw in my recruiter 2 cents, which is 100%. I would tell any person getting started in UX creating their portfolio, I'd rather you pick a blank slate Squarespace portfolio that actually shows me your work than trying to show me your personality on top of the work. Like, your ability to do the work is ultimately the goal. And
Yeah,
you don't have to create this it's a wow moment, but if it's going to stress you out, don't do it. Like, don't worry
yeah.
about coding website.
Oh, the other thing I will add is it was really important for me to get my portfolio in front of as many people as I possibly could.
Yeah.
So my mentor was like an important source of feedback because it helped me iterate like very quickly, like week after week. However, I also I joined a Discord group. I joined a couple of Reddit forums.
Mm-hmm.
I sought feedback from as many people as I could. I found people on LinkedIn who were UX designers. I sent it to them. As much feedback as I possibly could to sort of understand those different perspectives really helped me get it to where I was comfortable with it to be able to share it with the world. So I would say absolutely 100% share it with as many people as you could, get as much feedback as possible, but keep in the back of your mind that these are all individual opinions and perspectives. And what you do with that is,
Yeah. Yeah, but telling the story at the end of the day is going to be important. It is certainly how you tell it is your journey. But yeah, it is more than just the pretty assets we make. It's how you
yep.
got to the end of that journey. Taking notes along the way. I've also taken UX Academy, so I'd say take notes along the way and save all those little bits. Helps you with that end story. So we've got a question here. Do you think your high level of experience in marketing industry was helpful to land a job at an amazing company? What about your fellow peer? Hold on. The second part of this question is a little throwing me off. Let's start with the first part. Do you think your high level of experience in marketing industry was helpful to landing a job?
I think I think my experience was helpful in getting the job offers that I did get. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason why is because the specific positions that I did receive offers from were interested in somebody who had a little bit more maturity in their work history. So yeah, I would say in that respect, it did help me. It certainly didn't seem to help me in getting any of the jobs that I really wanted. When I mean, there were a few that when I saw the postings, I was like, there could not be a better job description for me than this particular job description.
Yeah.
And I even went as far as to like create individual like portfolio pages specifically tailored to those jobs. And I never heard a word back. So I think I think it really depends on like the type of person that they're looking for and the type of person that you are and the work experience that you bring to the table. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure there are tons and tons of places that are not looking for somebody with my history. They're probably they might be looking for people who have very little history so that they can sort of help shape, their thinkings. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. I would play into that as well and say that, you know, your background, your being the royal you out here in this event will come into a company in a unique way. If you're transitioning from education or a health field, that might really sing to a company. They might really appreciate that. And so some industries may seem really aligned and like
Yeah,
applicable to this change, but they all really are, because everybody's a user, right? Everybody's making something, and I mean, even a tire company needs a website. You know, like we all need. It's
100%.
broad.
Yep, 100%.
So I don't want people downplaying their backgrounds. Um,
No.
don't do it. We do have a question here. Do you think there's a stigma against someone pursuing UX without any college degrees?
Um, I would say no, actually. I think it's really about, like I said, I think it's really about what you bring to the table. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
it's so much, I mean, I have a college degree, but like, who cares? I mean, maybe people care, but
Applicable
like,
anymore.
I have a college degree in economics, and like, I can't even tell you the last time I used any of it.
Yeah.
But I really think it's about the work experience and the aptitude that you bring to the job and like what you have to contribute. And I don't think a college degree is necessarily your ticket. I don't think it's a ticket.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I can't tell you how many people I see their college degrees that have nothing. I mean, I wouldn't even say that had much to do with your marketing job.
Yeah,
There might have been, but you know, the it's more it's that story again, right? It's the I dedicated myself to something to learn, and doing this boot camp is also
yeah,
part of dedicating to learn, or doing your job.
yeah. I will also add that in my former career as a marketing and as a director of marketing and brand, I
Mm-hmm.
was often in the position of actually having to hire people. And although I do often see like degrees and colleges that people went to, I never considered that to be like of paramount importance. I always thought it was really about the experience and the portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got someone who's curious about what your day to day looks like at your current company. Speaking of getting to know what
Sure.
happens live.
Yeah. So I work with a product design team of about 10 people.
Mhm,
And this is a mix of senior level people, creative directors, product designers,
mhm.
and they are spread across 4 different time zones: New York, Berlin, London, Belarus.
Wow.
So it's very challenging to sync up with all of those different people when we need to. So my day starts typically at around like 8, where I look at all my email and I try to get through that. Try to assess like what the day is going to look like, and the days typically look like back-to-back meetings from 8:30 until about 1 p.m. And then no meetings from 1 p.m. on because everybody is like off.
Yeah.
Um, so the product design team in New York is 3 people, and I'm one of them, and we're all 3 designers. And what happens in those meetings is that I meet with the product manager. We have various what we call ceremonies. And the ceremonies might be looking at what all the jobs are on the job board and like which need to be prioritized. They could be about looking back on the previous sprint and understanding, getting a better understanding of what went well and what didn't go so well. Or they might be about the particular project that I'm currently working on. So I'm assigned to a very specific space in the artsy like world, and that space is dedicated to the partners who have artsy accounts. So I am currently in the midst of like doing some research and discovery on that. So today was a really good example of some of the work that I was doing. We had meetings with account executives
Mhm.
and support staff team, and the purpose of those meetings was to get from them their understanding of like what kinds of pain points our partners are experiencing. So it's it's a process of trying to tease out information without giving too much away about like what we're trying to do. And then I go back and I take all this information and I synthesize it in a way that I can then discuss with the product manager. So for example, tomorrow morning, I have a meeting with them where we're going to talk about all of these feedback points and we're going to decide, well, which are actionable, which are out of scope for the project, what are some of the ones that we need to sort of prioritize in terms of like the design has to address it. And then, as I mentioned, usually my afternoons are pretty free. So I reserve that time from like 1 p.m. on to doing like actual work. So
Not now.
a lot of my work,
I just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah.
Sorry.
A lot of the work has been it's been like flows, creating flows, sort of understanding where the product is currently,
Mhm.
understanding like some of the pain points. A lot of competitive analysis is happening, so I'm researching that on my own and trying to understand like what are some really really good design patterns in this particular space that we can like use.
Yeah.
And then I'm actually just starting to work on some high fidelity design. So I dipped into the design system today to sort of familiarize myself with all the components. So I will probably do a lot of that starting from tomorrow in conjunction with the continued research and discovery that needs to happen.
Very cool.
So a couple of times in the last several weeks, I've had to kind of backtrack a little bit and do some additional discovery, which is to be expected.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting comment you make about, doing the research, not just with participants, right, but also around like what exists already in this space,
Yep,
to help our users with their understanding, right? I think there can be often this misconception as students that, you have to invent the coolest, newest thing. And it's like often sometimes you need to find out what's working and use that in your designs because that's what's going to make it easier for your user. So interesting that you mentioned
100%. Yeah, 100%. It's my philosophy is rely on the design patterns that folks are familiar with.
Mhm.
And even better is try to find out which design patterns resonate with your particular audience. And that might be very, very different from, another kind of an audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question has gotten a lot of upvotes. And it's kind of going back to the interview process here. So what did your interviews look like? Was it like a mix of like behavioral and technical, whiteboard challenges, take homes? You touched on it a bit, but let's maybe expand a bit.
I actually never got a whiteboard challenge.
Okay.
Yeah, the hardest that it ever got for me was the two interviews where I had to present two additional case studies. And I was given about like 5 business days to prepare those case studies. And yeah, I mean, the brief was like super, super basic. It was like prepare two case studies that demonstrate how data has impacted your design decisions,
Uh-huh.
and take us through like what that process looked like and talk to us about all the teams that you worked with. So that was the extent of it. The initial interviews were typically like 2 or 1 to 1. And then as they got more intense, it became like a panel. So
Mhm.
those fourth round interviews were like, I think the biggest one I had was maybe like 6 people in a room in a Zoom, and then me presenting from home.
Mhm. And who did you meet with? Did you find that you like always met with the dev team or always met with project? Like who made up the interviews? Like who were there?
Um, the first round interviews were typical. Well, the first round interviews were almost always with recruiting or
Mhm.
somebody representing recruiting,
Uh-huh.
and then it moved into like the creative director,
Mhm.
and then it went to the SVP of product design or VP of product design, and then it would typically then expand to like engineering, product management, and then maybe an additional product designer. And
Mhm.
then the very end interview was like the panel. So that was like a room of like 6 people, and then you presented to everybody, and then you had to field everybody's questions.
Yeah. And did you find talking to those different groups of people, did you find that there were different, interviewing with the project managers versus the SVP versus the recruit? Like, Any advice
Yep.
on how to navigate those waters?
I mean, just like product designers are going to be different from company to company, I think those titles will also be different from company to company. However, I think there are core sets of responsibilities that all of those individuals have, no matter where they are. So it was really important for me to have questions at the ready for those specific folks.
Yeah.
Because you as a product designer will be working very closely with engineering, with product management. Possibly you might have FaceTime with senior level executives, and you should be able to come up with questions that you can ask them, in relation to how product design relates to their worlds, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, a typical easy question for engineering, for example, is like, how do you like to work with product designers? Like, how do you communicate with them? At what stage do you want to get involved in a product design decision?
Yeah.
I think folks who work with designers want to be involved. They want to be part of the conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we're getting close to time, but there's another question over here that got a lot of upvotes. Any particular tools you use that was effective in your job searching?
Well, you mean beyond like Hunter and those types of things?
Yeah. So we do have a lot of folks who are curious, like where you found your freelance role and like where you were applying. Where did you find the job you were actually able to get interviews with?
So the freelance role was actually just a very random thing that Nicole shared with me. Nicole, her last name is, yep. She said, here's this like tiny startup. It's like two guys and they're looking for somebody. And, if you're interested, you should reach out to them. Like, it was just kind of a matter of fact thing.
Yeah.
So I did. And like, that's how I wound up getting that. However, I will say, I also was, hanging out in places like Catch a Fire, which is a nonprofit website that connects designers to nonprofits that need design work.
Okay.
And there were several opportunities that I could have taken up on that website, but I couldn't because I took this one. There's another place for nonprofit work that's, God, what is it called? I forget what it's called, but anyway, there are definitely many, many opportunities to do short-term freelance work. You just kind of have to look for it.
Yeah, yeah. And you point out a really good thing, networking, talking to your friends. You don't know who knows somebody who needs work. So networking is
for sure
a huge piece of this. You never know who might have a connection for you. And
for sure.
Relationship building, which is what networking is, right? Go for it.
Yeah. The other thing that I did was I reached out to former clients of mine. And I said, hey, like I'm making this transition. I'm looking for some like hands-on work. Would you be interested in like doing some UX on this part of your website? Yeah. Would you be interested in doing like, whatever it might be? Like, have you ever explored the idea of an app for your nonprofit's website? So having conversations like this will open up opportunities for you, but you must be kind of proactive about them. They're not going to land on your lap.
Yeah. And so the last question that has a lot of upvotes here that we'll kind of wrap on is, did you take a pay cut in becoming an entry-level product designer from your previous role? You've mentioned that. And then to kind of tag onto that, how do you make that work?
So I did have to take a pay cut. I was a director at a pretty large corporation. And I knew that going in. I knew what the salary ranges were going to be because I did the research. So my expectation in terms of salary requirements were consistent with the offer that I received. I'm not going to say it was a major pay cut, but it was definitely a pay cut, and I definitely feel it. However, this is sort of like me resetting my career in a different direction. And now there is a path for me forward, whereas there wasn't necessarily a path for me forward in my previous job that I was happy with. So, to me, it's sort of like a trade-off. Like, do I want to eventually make the same amount of money? Sure. Is it going to take me a few more years? Yes, that's fine. Am I much happier where I am and what I'm doing? Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
And to me, like, you cannot put a price tag on that.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect, I mean, what a wonderful way to like kind of end this with this, you know, it's a challenge, you know, what we've talked about here, right? It's a challenge. It's a lot of work to make this transition, but ultimately, so it's proving to be so worth it. You're working in the field and you've had many interviews and honed in that portfolio and iterations. And you're there. And for those who are in the academy now or who are thinking about joining the academy, if you're putting that time and effort, you can do this too. And I get
100%.
little shivers, right? Because it's so powerful to do something that you feel good about doing every day. Yeah.
It's super important. It was super important to me. And I just want to say, like, I'm happy to talk to anybody, like, for whatever advice you might need. I'm happy to talk to you. Find me on LinkedIn, connect with me via my website. You know, I want to be able to help as many people as I possibly can. I know it's a tough road. I know the job interview process is super, super rough and it can be very demoralizing, but you know, you just got to hang in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. For everybody who has been here, this is recorded. So you will, if you've attended or you'll get it automatically emailed to you. You can also view it on our YouTube channel. And if you subscribe to us, you can always get, you know, notifications about that. We also post this kind of stuff on our Instagram and our Twitter. So give us a follow. But Peter, thank you so much. It was so inspiring and wonderful to hear about your journey. Congratulations on your role. And I'm excited to hear more about, you know, diving into those systems and what you create with those high five frames.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you. All right, y'all have a great rest of your day.